This is my introduction. My name is Xavier Penny. I'm doing a study on Parkinson's disease, and my lab is Thursday. All right. Parkinson's is a naturally degenerative disease of the brain that progresses over time. Some symptoms include tremors, shaking, rigidity, stiffness of muscles, dyskinesia, which is a dancing or flowing motion, and poor balance at the cause of it. Early studies show that signs were not in the spinal cord itself, but in the brainstem instead. There is a small portion of the brainstem called substantia nigra, which is a black substance or darker portion of the brain. On average, people get Parkinson's between the ages of 40 and 70 years old. Some people, their onset is sooner. They get it at an earlier age. And there are over 50,000 cases every year. Parkinson's has been around for centuries. In fact, there were mentions of it in Shakespeare plays that insinuated maybe they knew people back then with a shaking motion that they could not control. But people live with Parkinson's all the time. It's not a main killer, so it's not lethal. People can live with it for years before they pass. Parkinson's is caused by oxidation of dopamine, which is a process that breaks it down and metabolizes it. And sometimes it's metabolized too fast, which is the cause behind Parkinson's. The dopamine does not connect to the receptors after being sent through the synapses correctly. And if it's metabolized before it connects, then there's no off receptor. There are other reasons behind Parkinson's. There have been causes of genetics. It can be passed down. Scientists are still doing gene exercises to figure out exactly what causes it, what gene it is, and the mutation that causes it. Also in the mitochondria, there is an enzyme called MAOB that breaks down dopamine after it's released. And it produces a chemical called MPTP. Later on, when it's broken down further, it becomes MPP+, which that chemical aggressively degenerates the cells and causes the destruction of the cell that is irreversible. Another production of this chemical has been known in the past to be caused by synthetic heroin, which I want to say with the research was early 1900s. Someone concocted a synthetic heroin in a house-made lab, and it ended up being on the streets, and scientists ended up finding people taking this drug stiff, not able to move, not able to like fully react to the surroundings. So after research for years, they found that it was the drug that caused stiffness, which gave people Parkinson-like symptoms, or the rigidity aspect of them. So it can affect the frontal lobe of the brain, which controls voluntary movements. This can either be the rigidity aspect or the tremors. And sometimes people lose control of their expressions. They're not able to smile. They usually have a stern look on their face that they cannot control, or just a plain expression. And since it affects the brain, it can affect the cerebellum as a part of it, which is connected to the brain stem, and people can lose balance. And the brain stem is directly connected to the central nervous system, and the movements, mainly movements of the body. It controls all the muscles, breathing, lifting, just every motion. So quite naturally, if this is disturbed, all of your emotions are disturbed as well, or thrown off. The main side effect that a lot of people know about, because it's widely associated with Parkinson's, are the tremors. The tremors can not only occur in the hands, but it can occur all over the body. You can get a tremor in the pinky, you can get a tremor in the whole hand, the arm, the legs. It can be anywhere. Also, another side effect is dyskinesia. Unlike tremors, it's not a sharp motion. It's not like a shaking, but it is a flowing motion, almost like constantly losing balance and catching yourself. It almost looks as though someone is trying to dance when they have this symptom. Rigidity is another side effect, or symptom, that causes the muscles to be stiff. Some people aren't able to stand up, some people aren't able to lift their arms, and it's not exactly to that extreme all the time. Some people can lift their arms, but they can't lift them over their head because they might have a stiff muscle of the shoulder, or they might not be able to walk correctly because stiffness of the leg muscles. Rigidity could possibly be symptoms of other, I won't say diseases, but conditions. So everyone should check with their doctor before and make sure that their symptoms are related to Parkinson's disease or not. There were some studies behind a enzyme in mitochondria called coenzyme Q that was briefly mentioned in one of the books that I read, and it did mention that scientists are still researching this aspect of it, but they did notice when they were able to create the coenzyme and injected within the Parkinson's patients that their symptoms got better. So they're still doing research around that treatment and how to go about it. It didn't last like long, so they had to go back in and do research to figure out how to make it last longer, which is another form of treatment that they're working on. So there were and are different medications for Parkinson's. One is called levodopa. And what this medication does is increase the dopamine production of the cells that are still intact. So let's say you lose 30% of the cells that produce dopamine. This will increase the production in the 30% of the cells to boost the control of movement by shutting off the synapse, or release the dopamine through the synapse and be used as the off switch for the muscle movements. So it'll be more sharp, controlled, precise movements, and people have more control over them. There were two forms of this medication. One was like a high dosage. It worked relatively quickly. But the downfall to it is that it didn't last long, and when it wore off, the symptoms were worse. So I'm not sure exactly how often this one was used, but later on they came out with smaller doses, but over a span of time, so it became like a longer treatment span. And this method was used more often because even though it took longer to help and get patients to an ideal state, it was worth it in the end from a scientist or doctor standpoint because the effects lasted longer. Another medication was called carbidopa, which inhibited the enzyme that destroyed dopamine. So it would reduce the amount of dopamine that was destroyed, or the brain cells that would have been destroyed creating dopamine, if you get what I mean. Another was selegiline, which was a MAO inhibitor that stopped the production of MPTP, which I think this one was a reversal for the drugs, the synthetics that cause Parkinson's-like symptoms. There are other treatments. From the research, doctors would say or tell patients to increase vitamin intake. So like C, A, B, and D, and potentially the increase of these vitamins could help with a natural dopamine increase instead of the synthetic of the medication, depending on how far along they were, or with the medication that they're taking, as well as protein. As I read, doctors would prescribe their patients to consume less protein throughout the day, but more protein at night when they take the medication to help with the the meal would help the medication boost the dopamine production, or would help the effects of the medication in general. There's surgeries that can be done. The thalamotomy, which remove a portion of the thalamus that controls movements. This method was not very effective because in one of the books I read, I believe it was The Brainstorm. I'm not sure where it is right now. I forget the name of it, but I do have a reference page at the end. The author, he had Parkinson's, and the book was about his story and what the research that he had done and the doctors he had involved. But I believe he told of someone in there who had gotten a thalamotomy and the symptoms returned because it helped temporarily because it stopped the tremors. But then I believe tremors occurred on another side from the left side to the right side of the body. So after it stopped on the left side, after the thalamotomy, it came back on the right side. So it's not foolproof, and it's not a definite treatment. There's been talks of cell implantation, so like splicing DNA to remove the genes and recorrecting the genes to stop Parkinson's before it onsets if they can catch it, or to catch it and reverse it. From the research, they're still working on that one. That was not guaranteed. There was also stem cells from fetuses that were miscarried that they used in a procedure to try to also splice the genes and incorporate to repair. Because as we know, the stem cell help repair cells around it or throughout the body. That did not work as well as they would liked, so they created, because the body would reject the fetus cells, they created a medication to reduce the intensity of the rejection of the body, but it was not foolproof either, which I'm not sure where they're going with that one. Didn't get into too much detail, but that was one of the earlier treatments. And also, they're experimenting with medication and drugs that can go through the blood-brain barrier. There's not many drugs that are beneficial that can go through the blood-brain barrier, but they're like street drugs that can harm the body, such as the synthetic heroin that can travel through the blood-brain barrier. Additional treatments. So there, in the second book I read, I believe, Hello Life, Goodbye Parkinson's, they talked of the author, because I believe the author had Parkinson's in there as well, or maybe don't let me get this wrong. I know the book was about many people who had the Parkinson's. The author was getting the stories from different people. They do like a massage therapy. So let's say you're feeling stiffness of the arm. They would get the doctor's approval to figure out a treatment to try to see, what's going on, where it is. And they would massage the muscle that may be stiff or rigid. This would help stimulate the muscle. And with the person being aware that the muscle is being stimulated, hopefully it would help them get back into practice of moving that muscle in general. They also use meditation. At some part in the book, meditation and massage therapy was used together. So people could focus deeply without mentally being interrupted on the muscle that was being stimulated to further benefit them. Exercise, which was one of the another benefit or treatment that was used to get oxygen flowing through the body, get people moving around, to get the muscles that they haven't been using that are stiff or rigid, or the muscles that they can't use that are stiff or rigid, to loosen. And there were like stories of people who would dance. The author actually used that one quite a bit. That people would practice dancing as a treatment to control movements. So like a specific move, you would probably like lift an arm and turn your hand. Like let's say your wrist is, your forearm is rigid. So to like, they would probably practice moves where they would move the arm to try to focus on the muscles, or if they couldn't, they'd probably assist it, and someone would like help them move to get them in the motion or the mind set of moving that muscle. And so, as I said, I had a reference page. The books all that I read were actually pretty good, and one of the sites that I looked up online actually referred me to the Brainstorm book. Let's say Genes and Disease of the Parkinson's Disease by Natalie Goldstein was the first one, helped quite a bit. The second one that I mentioned, or the second one that I read, was Goodbye Parkinson's Hello Life by Alex Curtin. That was the one with the moving massage therapy and the dancing treatment. Really good book. Recommended. And also Brainstorms, about the guy who had Parkinson's himself, the author. John Palafran, I believe his name is. Really, really, really good book. It talks about there are different famous people who also had Parkinson's or have, and it talks about people living with it constantly. He from his point of view, he met performers, all sorts of people doing all sorts of things. He didn't know, that he wasn't the only one out there who had it, and it opened his eyes to see, that he wasn't alone. And he actually found doctors to help him do research and vice versa. So that is the presentation that I have. Thank you for your time, and goodbye.